afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. Andy Elliott and Maudwella Kirkendall are going to kick us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Special thanks to Greater Milwaukee Foundation. I'm not sure if anyone's here, but I just want to give you thanks. My name is Maudwella Kirkendall. Again, I am the Chief Operating Officer at Community Advocates.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Elliott. I'm the CEO for Community Advocates.
And most of you guys probably know this already, but Community Advocates has been around for 50 years, and our main objective has been to provide individuals with services and skills so that they may meet their basic needs. And we've been doing this again for like 50 years. At one point, we decided, we were lucky enough to have David, and we decided we wanted to open up the Policy Institute and look at the issues more upstream and decide or look into why people are coming through our doors so much and how can we do things and what policy can we create so that we can prevent them from coming through our doors time after time. And the public policy was born. I mean, then we were trying to address conditions around housing, healthcare, utility assistance, and again, just trying to make sure individuals have stable housing for them and their families. We need to begin shaping policies that support our community members instead of putting barriers in place to prevent their success.
I'm sorry. So in the first few years of the Public Policy Institute, which started in 2008, we started with conversations regarding healthcare. This is before the Affordable Care Act, if anybody remembers that, when that was dark times, plus mental health parity and transitional jobs. So one of David's special areas of concern is crafting policy proposals that will drastically reduce, almost eliminate poverty in the U.S., not by making a handful of changes to policies that have bipartisan support. Today, you're going to hear from David about his seven-part policy package that would have incredible and positive impact on Americans. That includes parents and kids relying on childcare, people living with disabilities, people earning minimum wage, and seniors. I hope that it sparks a new conversation about how smart policies can benefit people, how public policy can be a force for good. We are grateful to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Kohl Philanthropies, and Brad Brin, who supported the Urban Institute's data analysis of this package. I'd also like to thank the Public Policy Institute Member Network, who is sponsoring this gathering today. And I don't know if we have any dignitaries in the room. I think we have a bigger presence online. But with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, David Riemer.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me get these so they don't block me or anybody else. I wanted to begin by just thanking you all for coming. And I particularly wanted to thank several organizations and individuals who made this project possible and this event possible. To begin with, great thanks to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. They were a sponsor of this effort. Let me get to, oops, there we go. Greater Milwaukee Foundation provided the largest initial grant. Very much appreciate that. And there were several people within that organization I wanted to mention by name. Initial conversation we had with Ellen Gilligan, who at that time was the head of the organization. Greg Wesley, the current head, I know is someone who is very interested in this project. Along the way, I spoke with Janelle Hines, David Salata, who's here, and Ian Batista, who is here somewhere over there. Okay, good to see both of you. Two other people who were very helpful in kind of gaining the focus on this from the Greater Milwaukee Foundation were Corey Nettles and Michael Morgan. So I just want to give a shout out to both of them. And Benjamin Porter, who I just met today, has been very helpful in getting this set up. So thanks very much to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. We'll be talking mostly about the this policy package and its impact on the United States. But I will be speaking also about impact on Wisconsin and Milwaukee. So there's a good reason for organizations that are rooted here in Milwaukee to be concerned about this question, this problem, and potential solutions. The other major Milwaukee foundation that was supportive of this was Kohl Philanthropies. Joanne Anton, who's the head of it, just stepped right up and provided matching funding to GMF. And that was just greatly appreciated. They get support from Senator Kohl's philanthropy. I had the chance over the decades to know Senator Kohl as well as Joanne. I worked with her and just know how dedicated they are as well to what we'll be talking about. And then finally, another person who helped out with resources, personal resources, was Brad Brin, a philanthropist. Brad was hoping to be here. He was and his wife were in Japan. I hope they make it back, despite the confusion that's going on with transportation. But just wanted to be sure to acknowledge Brad's role and support. Many people at Community Advocates played a role in both getting this project off the ground and bringing us to this event today. And I just want to mention the ones that I've listed. You've met two of them already, Andy Elliott, the CEO, and Maudwella Kirkendall, who I believe his title is COO. Do I have that right? Chief Operating Officer. Thanks to both of you again. In addition, Bill Cook, who's the CFO, not here today, but it's been very supportive. Aaron Orlowski, Deborah Hefner, Carrie Southern, who was deputy head of the Policy Institute for many years, I know was quite supportive along the way. And then Lisa Kaiser and Alyssa Tapia and Hannah Lepper, who are here, have been very helpful in just many, many ways. The PowerPoint that you're looking at it's got my words in it and some of my graphs, but the design of it, the color, the attractiveness of it is really due mostly to Alyssa. So thank you, Alyssa. I skipped over some slides that talk about starting point, but I want to talk about the starting point because it's really important. What is the starting point for thinking about how to improve the lives of low-income people, poor, near poor, working people who are are struggling to make ends meet, people who are kind of on the on-ramp to the middle class but aren't securely there yet? How do we think about them? And there's lots of different choices. We can think about people in terms of geography, age, gender, race and ethnicity. But the question is, for the point of view of figuring out what policies will afford them the economic security that they're looking for and that most of us wish they had. It's always been my view, this goes back many decades now, to believe that the starting point is adults' relationship with the labor market. I began actually working on that starting point with Julie Kirksick, who is here today, former head of the New Hope Project and other organizations, work with her and Connor Williams in doing prototypes of this model. So thanks, Julie, and I know Connor would be here if you could. So to me, the starting point for all this is adults' relationship with the labor market, the way it should be, the way they want it, the way we want it. And if you think about it, every adult has some sort of relationship with the labor market, and through those adults, their children do. So what are those different relationships? The first is people want to work. They consider themselves workers, but they don't have a job, or they don't have a full-time job. The second relationship is they're working, but they don't get paid enough, or their earnings and wages fluctuate so much that they're not dependable. A third relationship, which this model doesn't get into, but I'll just mention it in passing. People sometimes need to take a leave from their job to care for a newborn child, an adopted child, a relative who needs help getting into assisted living or a nursing home. I'm seeing heads nodding. We've all gone through this experience in one way or another. And then they go back to work. They are on paid leave from a job, likely to go back to the very same job. Another relationship that's really important is the relationship with the costs of living that so dig into your income that you really, on paper, with a gross income, you start out ahead. But by the time you subtract taxes and, ta-da, the cost of childcare, very often the cost of housing and the cost of healthcare, you're pushed back into poverty and necessity again. Another relationship, which many people will not necessarily at first blush think of as connected to the labor market, is the situation that people find themselves in if they have a severe disability. But the reason I call that a labor market connection is this: to be determined so disabled that you get a benefit, you have to be determined to be unable to work. So you are a disabled worker. The system assumes that you can work to support yourself and your family, but then evidence is presented, too often rejected, people come back and appeal, but they are, disabled workers. And then, of course, the final group that I'm in, retired workers. You don't get Social Security, old age pensions, unless you have worked 40 quarters for a certain number of dollars per quarter, or per year. Sometimes they organize it that way. Well, divide 40 by 4 calendar year quarters, that's 10 years. Most people have reached 40 quarters by the time they're 35 and keep on working for decades. So most people on Social Security are not working now. Some are, either because they have to or because they want to, but it's fair to call them retired workers. So we've got all these different groups of workers. And the challenge that I tried to face in putting together what you'll be hearing about now is, how do you change the relationship between people, adults, with or without kids, and their unique at that moment relationship, sometimes more than one relationship, with the labor market. There's several big impediments, 3 big impediments that I'll mention. The first is, and I have all kinds of charts for this, but they're not in this PowerPoint. When we compare the number of unemployed people or underemployed people with the number of job openings, for decades, the number of people who want work has exceeded the number of job openings. There have been exceptions. As we were coming out of COVID, for example, we had more jobs than workers, but that's the exception. The BLS data is very clear on this, and it's not just in the United States, it's true in the UK and other countries. There are more adults who want to work, but don't have any work at all, officially unemployed, compared to the number of openings. So that's a huge problem, not enough jobs to go around. Second problem is the one that we're more familiar with, which is an awful lot of jobs don't pay enough. At the minimum wage or even above the minimum wage, it's not enough money when you subtract taxes that are obligatory, like FICA and Medicare, to be able to afford just basic costs, not the extraordinary costs of childcare and healthcare and so on, but just basic costs. And then the third problem is that for those whom we don't expect to work by virtue of a disability or retirement, we understand that they will get a payment, sometimes an earned benefit, as is true for any part of the Social Security system. It's not enough to get them above any poverty line that's out there. So a lot of good ideas are out there about how to solve these problems. And this approach is not meant to disparage any other alternative. But one thing that I found in my work, both in modeling and working with Julie and others on the New Hope Project, is that to have a big impact, you need a combination of policies. You need what we call a policy package of different policies interacting with each other. So what I asked the Urban Institute to do about a year and a half ago was to take a 7-part work-based package of policies and see what it would do. And the bottom line of this whole presentation is it would dramatically improve workers' economic security, greatly reduce poverty, and greatly reduce near poverty, people just above the poverty line, but expand by a huge, huge percent in number the middle class. So the policy package rests on these 3 principles. The first is make work available to unemployed and underemployed adults until they can be absorbed in the regular labor market. This is not meant to be where people permanently want to end up, where we want them to end up. The idea is to make it there if they're having difficulty sustaining paid work in the regular labor market, by which I mean the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the government sector. So make work available. Secondly, make work pay. And there are several different components of this, one of which is make sure that wages provide a solid foundation, then also supplement that foundation. We'll talk a lot about the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which either formally or de facto basically make work pay more than the wage and the earnings that you get in the labor market. And then another way to make work pay is to be sure that the earnings you get after taxes aren't eroded by the extraordinary cost of childcare. I don't know how many of you have kids or grandkids where they're grappling with the cost of childcare, but it's really expensive. I mean, show of hands here, if you heard about this, experienced this, it's something that many older people didn't have to deal with as much, but a lot of younger people are dealing both with the cost of it and just getting the care. And then the third principle is recognize that there are some people who temporarily or permanently have a disability so severe that they can't work, we don't expect them to work, or have worked their whole life, decades sometimes, but still end up with a pension in the case of Social Security, or a disability benefit like SSDI, not to be confused with SSI. I'll talk about that a bit later. Make sure that those payments don't leave them destitute, don't leave them poor. The other thing that I wanted to focus then on is this. These are the 7 policies, and I'm going to go to the next slide to sort of show how the principles that I've been talking about relate to these policies. 7 policies. The first one is to create a national transitional jobs program, similar to the old Works Progress Administration of the New Deal, the WPA. The basic idea here is that the federal government would finance jobs for unemployed and underemployed people. They would be paid to do useful work. If you want to see all the projects that were done during the Great Depression, just in Milwaukee, go to something called livingnewdeal.org, and you will see, 100 or more projects. And a lot of the projects that were done, you can't see because people were digging ditches for sewer mains or water mains or sewer lines or other kinds of things that were not so much ephemeral, but underground, literally. Or they made supplies for schools that were then consumed. But we have a map now of 19,000 or more projects from that era. I suspect all of us, as we drive around Milwaukee or any place, have seen a problem and said, I wish someone would fix this. From clean up this park, fix this pothole, restore this beautiful old building, create a more activity for kids to do in the summer, get that splash pad to open up sooner. There are lots of work that a lot of us think should be done that would improve the quality of life and safety in our communities. It's not getting done. So combine people's need for work with work that we need to have done to make our communities better. To make work pay, 4 policies. The first is expand the minimum wage. The current federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, has been frozen for, I think it's 19 years or so, 16 years, sorry, enacted in 2009. Well, there's been a little bit of inflation since then. So $7.25 today would be a lot more. More and more people are talking about $15 an hour, $17.50. The model that we used was $17.50. Some have said even higher, make it 20. We had to pick a number, so we picked a number using 2018 data that translates into $17.50 an hour. But for many people, even that's not enough. So the third policy was to increase the earned income tax credit. Now, many of you've heard about it, and some of you have a familiarity with its structure. I won't talk too much about the current structure, but to say that this model changes somewhat the structure of the EITC, an earnings supplement, and increases the amount. So the proposal here is to have an EITC that is equal to 50% of workers' earnings up to $4,000 per worker, and to do that for each worker in a household. So there's no perverse incentive to live together and not get married if they really want to get married, because the current EITC looks at combined marital earnings. So in some cases, people who get married find out they lose their EITC because the earnings are combined. So $4,000 per worker, and then an additional 50% up to $2,500 for child number one, child number two. Gets rid of the marriage penalty. It greatly increases the amount a lot for people without any dependent children, but it also increases it somewhat for people with 1, 2, or 3 dependent children. So that's, again, making work pay by saying we want a lot of heavy lifting here by increasing the minimum wage, but for many people, it's just not enough. A fourth policy was to bring back that expanded child tax credit that we actually had as law in this country for 1 year, 2021. The evidence is that it reduced child poverty by 40%, just that one change. The idea here is to take that policy, bring it back into law. The only change is that rather than phasing it out, once people's income as an individual reaches $200,000 or $400,000 if they're married, it can be phased out a little earlier and still go well into the middle class. Even the upper middle class would benefit from that. And then the fourth policy, the fifth policy, is to make childcare free, just like K-12. It's expensive, but it's not that complicated. Right now, more and more kids already are getting 3-year-old, 4-year-old kindergarten, sometimes half-time. There are all kinds of programs, including Head Start, that provide childcare, high-quality early childhood education. This basically says, let's just do that from birth until they enter the school system. So those are the policies that add up to making work pay. And then the third principle, make sure that disabled and retired workers have a decent income. Somewhat arbitrarily, I said, let's raise the SSI benefit so it's 175% of the poverty line for a single adult. Raise Social Security so it's a little bit higher, 190. Why the difference? Because we want to incentivize people to get into Social Security. The SSI program, now, if you earn $1, you lose $1 in benefits. There's some exceptions, but that's the general rule. This policy changes that to make it a little more favorable. But Social Security, frankly, is a better deal in terms of getting ahead. If you want to work part-time, you aren't penalized as much as SSI. So getting people to get into Social Security is a good idea. So that's the policy package. There are a couple of shared design features that cut across these policies, and I'll just quickly tick them off. As you can see, this is a 7-part work-based policy package. All of these policies promote work. You don't get anything from a transitional job unless you take the job and do the work and get paid for it. Obviously, only workers get the EITC. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The child tax credit right now is based on earnings. Before 2021, it was based on earnings. Even when it's not based on earnings, most of the people who get it are workers. So in practice, de facto, it is an earnings supplement. And there might be some ways to make it connected to work, but not necessarily current earnings. Because most people on it either are current workers or they were workers before, but they may have taken a year off to do something good. So the idea here is to think of the child tax credit as heavily supplementing earnings for the overwhelming majority of people on it. Second policy that cuts across this is to not have any new means test. Means test is a fancy word that means you got to be poor to get help. And the more, if you work or you get married and you're less poor, the benefit gets taken away. Sometimes it's gradually taken away. Sometimes you earn $1 too much or get married and you fall off what they call a cliff. You lose the whole benefit. And that still happens with Medicaid. We've been hearing a lot about these cliffs that people fall off. This policy package has no cliffs. It adds no means test. It doesn't even rest, except with one exception, on existing programs that have a means test. That exception is SSI, which is based not just on being unable to work, but being poor. But the model actually gets rid of some of the means tests. It gets rid of the asset test, for example, which is used. And right now, instead of taking $1 away from you if you earn $1, it takes away still too large an amount, but less, a lot less. So either there are no new means tests or reducing the ones that exist. And then the final thing, which I've already mentioned, is getting rid of the barriers to marriage. People's decisions about marriage should be their decisions, whether to marry, who to marry, but we shouldn't have the government penalizing people if they make that decision. Current law does that. This gets rid of one of the major provisions in law in the earned income tax credit that penalizes marriage. You'll see a number of slides coming up, and I'll try to go through them quickly. But there's one slide that really captures the essence of this whole policy package, and that is that its individual components have only a small to modest effect on poverty. But when you put them together, you see a dramatic effect. This, by the way, is the cover and some QR code to the Urban Institute report, which this whole PowerPoint will be online, so you'll be able to see this a lot more easily and go to it. Urban Institute, for those who don't know, is a DC-based analytic firm, very independent. I asked them questions. I didn't tell them what the answers were. Some people do that in Washington, DC, I'm told. But my approach is to ask the questions and let the experts tell me what the data say, whether I like the answer or not. But in this case, I was pleased, not entirely surprised, to see this dramatic effect. So I guess on your left, the top bar, the one that says 11.4%, was the poverty rate in the United States of America in 2018, using something called the supplemental poverty measure. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but the key to remember here is it counts all resources, not just cash, and it uses a much more realistic set of thresholds or poverty lines than the current measure. It ends up often producing very similar outcomes, but it's a better way of measuring poverty. Most academics, I think, and think tank folks would agree with that. 2018, 11.4% of Americans were poor. Each one of these policies standing alone had an effect, a little bit more than a little effect, but it required them all to be interacting with each other as a package to drive poverty down from 11.4% to 3.1%. That's like, I think, a 72% reduction in the number of America's poor population. As you'll see later, it's about a 27 million person reduction in how many Americans are poor. The reductions were essentially the same across all age groups. Again, the blue is the baseline, the starting level of poverty. Here you can see, kids, working adults, seniors, and the poverty rates for them. These are residents, by the way, were generally in the 2 to 4% range. This shows the breakdown by race. Huge reductions for every group. And I put in this table on your left to show that not only was everybody seeing a big reduction, but it was slightly higher for Black Americans compared to white. So it somewhat reduced racial disparity. Not so much for Hispanic residents, but that brings us to the next slide. When we shift from residents to citizens, the Black poverty reduction still remains high, roughly 79%. Hispanic catches up, just 1 percentage point less. And both of them are now somewhat higher than the white poverty rate. Why is that? Well, because, no surprise, a higher share of Hispanics in the United States are not legal residents. And therefore, some of the benefits that this existing law, as well as this package, rest on, didn't flow to them. So they're not eligible, for example, even though they're often paying taxes that finance Social Security, if they're not legally present, they don't get the benefit. But so the point is that this policy package has dramatic effects for every group, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and then others. But it has slightly higher benefits for Blacks, just residents and citizens, and for Hispanic citizens. For education, the reductions are even greater by education. Those with less than a high school degree see an 81% reduction in their poverty rate, from 25% down to 6.3%. All the other groups show huge reductions as well, rough 2/3 or more. So this is cutting across every group. I don't have a slide up for men versus women, males versus females, but they essentially go down by pretty much the same, roughly 72, 73% reduction, slightly more reduction for women than men, but not a huge difference. One of the most dramatic effects is that those getting supplemental security income benefits as a result of a disability, which are the two of the charts, the two of the bars in the middle, and those getting Social Security, just plain Social Security, old age retirement, typically see a reduction in poverty to under 2%. We're never going to get rid of poverty down to zero, folks. I mean, but getting down to 1.5%, that's about as good as it's going to get. And this model achieves that for people we don't expect to work because they have a disability or because they've retired in old age. What's driving a lot of these changes? Well, a large part of what's driving them is the policy package's impact on employment and earnings. It increased the number of working Americans by almost 7 million. And that's a net, because as you'll see from this chart, the subsidized jobs program, the transitional jobs program, added about 3.7 million workers. But the larger increase was due to people going into the private sector because of the incentive effects of the earned income tax credit and childcare. If you get this big supplement to your earnings, then de facto you're earning more from that job, more likely to take a job if you have a choice, a second job, a third job, more hours in an existing job. And then childcare obviously frees people up with a higher level of comfort to be able to go and take a job that they'd love to be in. Maybe they were in it, but they decided to stay home because of childcare. Well, this helps to offset that disincentive, create an incentive. And that's 4.8 million people. The other policies actually had somewhat net negative effects. I think that the minimum wage, that's the one that shows the 1.461 reduction in employment. I think that that's because, yes, the higher wage incentivized people to work, but it also probably incentivized some employers to eliminate jobs. So you've got conflicting incentives. This is an example. This is where I wish they hadn't said this, but this is what they said the data showed. So there's the number. They're being quite careful to not overestimate the positive incentives of a high minimum wage compared to the negative ones. The child tax credit, there's mixed studies about this, but there's some reason to think that there may be a slight reduction in employment, not in the number of jobs, but in the number of people working. Well, why is that? I mean, think of it this way. If you were working a third job and you had the opportunity to get a couple $1,000s because of a younger child, you might say, I'll take that money and stay home. So it's not clear. And of course, some people might not work at all, which is part of what this is measuring. But the bottom line, as I said, is that this adds almost 7 million to the American workforce. It also adds 323 billion, they estimated, of earnings, money that helps to finance FICA and Medicare taxes, money that is mostly going to be spent on consumption. More people buying groceries, more people going to hardware stores, more people paying off car loans and student loans and so on, getting themselves on a better financial footing. It may, in some cases, allow people to save a little bit more or save in the first place. So it may contribute to wealth accumulation. And we don't know the answer to that. I'm getting near the end here, but I'm coming up to maybe the second most important slide I want to emphasize. This started out as a narrow focus on reducing poverty. But we also asked the Urban Institute to look at the impact on the groups above the poverty line, just kind of out of curiosity, not quite idle curiosity, but I was interested. What happened to people above 100% or above 150%? And I was staggered by the result. This shows that in addition to a 73% reduction in poverty, which is the first red bar going downwards, and the almost 56% reduction in near poor, people between 100 and 150% of the poverty line, it shows that the middle class grew by 27%. Now, the percents look bigger at this end and smaller at the other end. But one basic rule of math that I learned a long time ago, looking at Bruce Thompson, because he probably learned it at a much younger age than I did, is that when you multiply a small number by a large percent, even though it's a large percent, and then you compare that with a very large number multiplied by a smaller percent, the larger number multiplied by the smaller percent often produces a much bigger final number, okay? And that's exactly what's happened here. So the number of poor Americans in 2018 would have dropped by 27 million, according to this policy package. The number of near poor, where the percent drop was lower, would have been even higher, because they're more in that group between 100 and 150%. So almost 28.5 million. Where do they go? Well, they kind of move, as you look at it, towards the left. Where most of them go is above 200% of the poverty line, which is the big green bar on the far left. This model would shows that the middle class, which is often defined as at or above 200%, would grow by 51 million Americans. 51 million Americans. I asked my Perplexity AI account to tell me, well, how many states' populations would you have to add up in 2018 to get to 51 million? And it came back and said 21 states, the lowest population states. That's about 13 million persons bigger than the state of California. So it's a huge, huge number. It's like 10 Wisconsins. It's a vast increase in the people in the middle for whom the dollars that go into getting above 200% mean more money for food, more money for utilities, more money for housing, more money for childcare, more money for toys and a vacation and taking the kids to Disney World. I mean, it's a huge impact, not just on the numbers, but on the way people live. I know some of you are keenly interested in seeing what this means for our state and our city. It's the same pattern. The number of poor Milwaukeeans in Wisconsin would fall, this is the state of Wisconsin, would fall by 300,000. The near poor would be double that, the reduction, roughly 1 million more crossing the line into the on-ramp to the middle class and beyond. So our state is what, 5.7 million people? So we would be moving 1 million of those 5.7 million people from poor or near poor into the middle class. So that's Wisconsin. This is the Milwaukee metro area. It's the same pattern. 100,000 fewer poor, 230,000 fewer near poor, 300,000 and change above 200%. So just sort of imagine driving down North Avenue or up 27th Street and imagining that the world is populated by folks who have incomes like this, as opposed to where they are now. So it would be a dramatic change. I don't have this breakout level for any other state or metro area, but it's going to be roughly the same everywhere. It's expensive. You don't get results like this without spending money. So the cost of the policy package, the gross cost, is over $1 trillion. That, however, is offset by two kinds of factors, savings. One is that means-tested programs like TANF, like WIC, like SNAP, like LIHEAP would decrease in cost simply because fewer people would be eligible under current rules. This isn't kicking people off. This is just applying the rules that were in place in 2018. And had this policy package been the law back then, fewer people would have qualified, or those that did qualify would have gotten less. And that's what's supposed to happen. Much bigger than that reduction is a 230 million increase in revenue, much of which is because, going back to that $300 billion of extra earnings, those people are paying FICA taxes, Medicare taxes, their employers are matching those amounts, and they're also beginning to pay income taxes. So you add all that up, it brings the net cost down to $807 billion. Now, we've kind of reached, this just breaks it out with greater detail. We've come to the end of the Urban Institute data. So what you're seeing here is just David Riemer's ideas about how to pay for $807 billion. And the main idea here is that raising that kind of federal revenue can be accomplished without raising local property taxes, without raising state income taxes or state sales tax rates, without increasing any of the specialty taxes at the federal level, like the gas tax or trying to think of what other special taxes they've got. None of that. It doesn't even require changing the tax rates applied either to individuals or corporations. You can achieve $1.5 trillion of additional revenue by first increasing the staff of the IRS, according to the Congressional Budget Office, just to collect almost $200 billion that's owed legally under the current law, but not collected. Basically, high-income people and corporations getting away with tax evasion because you have an IRS that doesn't have the capacity to make them pay not even their fair share, but just their legally obliged share. The second idea would be to take some of the tax breaks, not specifically focusing on what Congress just passed a couple months ago, but just going back to 2018. If in 2018, the top quintile, the top 20% of federal income tax filers had seen their between the 81st and the 90th percentile had a phase out of their tax breaks, their tax expenditures, as economists call them. And then we just got rid of them for the top 10%, as if we need to incentivize the top 10% to buy a home or give to charity or whatever. You could raise $500 billion. And then another idea that is kind of being talked about is to have something called a financial transaction tax. So if I go out and buy a book bag or a computer or a phone, pay sales tax. I don't know what the combined Milwaukee sales tax rate is these days, but what, 6-7% roughly. Illinois is about more. People cross borders if they're making big expenditures to avoid sales tax increases, the differential between one state and another. But if anyone in this room goes out and buys 10,000 shares, or let's say 1,000 shares of AT&T, do you know how much you pay as a fee or a tax on that transaction? Not 2%, not 0.2%, not 0.02%, but 0.002%. So if we just made that 0.2%, that would mean that on a purchase of $1,000, you would pay $2. Now, all of us probably in the last week have bought something and paid sales tax and bought small items, hardware store or something. How many of you remember exactly how much in sales tax you paid on the smaller items you purchased? Anybody in the room? I mean, we just don't know. Even when we go to a restaurant and they add it on, the only reason we pay attention to it is, well, does the tip based off of X% of the pre-tax or the after-tax? That's probably the only sales tax bottom line most of us ever pay attention to and that's usually 6 or 7%, far more than this. So my point is that, again, this is another example of applying a small percent to an incredibly large number. You get a huge amount of revenue. I don't think this would change the financial markets whatsoever. People would still be pursuing good purchases and good sales. It's just that the fee would go up from 2/1000ths to 2/10ths of 1%. So that's another way to pay for it. The point here, and I'm getting close to my last slides, what do people think about this? All of these policies individually have huge support from Democrats, huge support from independents, and Republicans support half of them, or 4 out of the 7, by more than 55%, and getting pretty close to 50% on the rest. When you look at the overall American opinion about these policies, you know, 60% up to 80%. So the bottom line here is that we have a policy package that is based on work, not poverty, not requiring poverty, not requiring means testing. It doesn't discourage marriage. We have now solid evidence from the Urban Institute that it would produce these dramatic effects on employment, on earnings, on poverty, on near poverty, and then positive effects on increasing the middle class. The American public likes these things. And to offset the cost and put in, you know, almost $500 billion or $250 billion to help reduce the deficit in the federal debt, if you wanted to use the excess that way, you could do that without going after ordinary Americans. This is workable, it's popular, and it's financially doable. So what do we do next? One thing is that, you know, this is a message that Wisconsinites will resonate with too. We could do some stuff in our laboratory of democracy to try things out at the state level. That's how we got workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, all kinds of things that the national government then replicated, mostly during the New Deal. That Wisconsin was a pioneer. We could be a pioneer again. And if not Wisconsin, some other state. Many states have already raised their minimum wage to $15 or higher. Many states have, I think most states now have, a state supplemental earned income tax credit. Some have a supplemental child tax credit. Governor Grisham of New Mexico just announced a universal free childcare program. So all across the country, people are doing large chunks of what I'm talking about. So one thing to do is keep doing those chunks, keep making it happen out there in the states so that kind of wakes people up, people pay more attention. Maybe some state will try to do the whole thing, if not in the whole state, maybe as an experiment in some county. And then ultimately the goal, though, is to get a lot of this done at the federal level. I worked with Julie and Connor Williams and others at Community Advocates with Senator Tammy Baldwin on this legislation that she introduced twice in 2016 and 2017 that took several of these policies, put them into law. She actually came to Milwaukee to Community Advocates with Senator Cory Booker to talk about this. So again, we could have the chunks enacted at the federal level, maybe have a federal law that tries it out on a large-scale model in some county or state. Ultimately, this should become national law. That's the way to get there. So I probably have talked longer than I should have. I'm going to just move on. Here's how you can reach me if you've got questions or comments. Before we got here, there were some questions that were posed by various people some of whom are listening online. And while you collect your thoughts, because I suspect some of you have great questions, I can take up a few of the ones they asked, and then we'll get to you if that's okay. Just sort of find what they were asking about. The questions, most of the questions came down to, well, how do you actually do this? You know, are these actionable options? How do you influence these changes? What do we need to do that we're not doing now? I think the first step is to get the word out about this. That's why we're here today, to talk about it, spread the word. We need to just keep doing that and talking about it, not just in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, but at the national level. And I'll be spending much of the next year or longer talking about it, particularly, to those in Washington who have a handle on federal policy. I think also there's opportunities to go to elected officials, the city level, the state level, the federal level, and say, get this drafted. Let's see what it looks like as law. Some of these changes are already bills. The minimum wage increase, for example, is pretty similar to ones they've already been introduced in Congress with a lot of support. Others have ideas similar to this that have been turned into bills. One of my goals is to see this whole package drafted just so that we can look at it and sort of poke holes in it, see what needs to be fixed in it, get it introduced, get hearings on it. That would be very, very helpful. And then ultimately, when the stars align, we'll know what to do. Part of why we have the social insurance system that we now have, unemployment insurance and disability insurance and old age pensions and a minimum wage, is because in the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of talk about that stuff in Wisconsin, all around the country. Bills were introduced at the state level, the federal level. So when, sadly, the economy collapsed and unemployment went up to 25% and prices sank and wages sank and so on, Franklin Roosevelt and his allies were not standing there gaping, wondering what the heck to do. They knew that there were ideas out there, some of which had been tested and tried at the local level, and they put them into effect at the federal level. We think about the Social Security Act as old age pensions. It included unemployment insurance. It included other programs. They tried initially to get disability benefits in there. That took until the 50s to happen. They tried to have national health insurance. That was dropped, but it came about in chunks with Medicaid, Medicare, Obamacare. We've still got a long way to go. Other things like the jobs program were enacted and implemented on a large scale, but then when World War II came, people, everybody had a job. Basically, anybody who could fog a mirror could have a job. Then after the war, we were the only economy in the world that mattered. So for almost a decade, we weren't worried about foreign competition. I grew up in an era when made in Japan meant junky things that fell apart, and nothing was made in China. I mean, I can't remember anyone I knew in the 50s or 60s or even the 70s ever buying anything made in China. So for some of you in this room, that will be a startling confession, but you can see how much the world has changed. But the point here is that what we need to do in order to trigger a response, to trigger action, is to talk about it, get it out there. That may fail, let's be honest about it. On the other hand, if we don't do it, the chances of failure are 100%. So that's how I answer that. What can be done in Milwaukee about this? Again, I think a lot of talk about this, getting the word out, would be helpful. We could consider doing some sort of experiment in Milwaukee. I worked with Julie on the New Hope Project, I won't call it a smaller version of this because the policies were fewer in number, but it actually involved roughly 1,200 people, control group, experimental group. We were able to measure a lot of things. Took years to set up, a couple of years. Took a couple of years to run, $18 million maybe, roughly, I'm close to it. So it's expensive and time consuming, but we could do something like that. I guess I'd suggest that if we were to think about something like that, we'd not just want to do it in Milwaukee. We'd want to pick a small town and, in a different part of the state and say, this isn't just for the center city of Milwaukee. It's something that's needed everywhere. So that could be done. We're fortunate that two of our legislators in Congress are people who care a lot about these issues. Congresswoman Moore and Senator Baldwin are very aware of these issues. Congresswoman Moore sits on the House Ways and Means Committee that controls a lot of the policies related to the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and so forth. Senator Baldwin also is very, committed and interested in these ideas. So this is a good place from which to talk about this stuff. One question that I got, and then I'll stop and open it up. Do we really want to pay attention to the middle class? Why not just focus on just getting the poor above the poverty line or almost above it and stop there? And I have a couple of answers to that. One is that if you concentrate a program on the poor, that means taking it away from people when they stop being poor or they're less poor, which means it's a means-tested program and they have to show with their income, maybe their assets. Often it creates disincentives to work, creates a cliff sometimes. It creates a lot of complexity and sometimes some perverse incentives. The other thing I would say is that we have the two programs that we now have in this country that do the most for poor people are Social Security and Medicare. They are not limited to the poor. People often, in my view, mistakenly refer to them as the safety net, part of the safety net. There's some truth to that. But the overwhelming majority of people there are not poor. They're middle class. But there's no other programs that do as much for low-income people without the hassle of proving how poor you are and penalizing you if you work and get married than Social Security and Medicare. So, if we're going to pick a model to follow, why not pick a model? Why pick a model that's somewhat unpopular, imposes these means tests on the poor, creates persons incentives, underwrites, stimulates all kinds of negative racial and ethnic, stereotypes. The classic one of the black mother with all kinds of kids driving a Cadillac to pick up a welfare check. We remember that from Ronald Reagan's era. Not true, but it's the kind of stuff that biases attitudes. No one says that about Medicare or Social Security. That's my answer, that the best way to help low-income people is to include them in programs that don't require you to be a low-income person to get help. Some people will disagree with that. Another reason I like that is that the federal government, even no matter what political stripes it's bearing, is more inclined to pick on welfare programs like SNAP and WIC and LIHEAP and even Head Start and Medicaid than it's likely to pick on Social Security and Medicare. So, why focus on programs that Congress picks at, doesn't like, sometimes tries to gut? Why not go with programs that, even though they may want to gut them, they're afraid politically to do so? So that's part of my answer to that question. Let me stop there. I've lost track of time, and thank you for your attention and patience, but questions from you? Oh, great.
I think what we'll do is I'll ask an online question, go to in-person, back, go back and forth. Testing. Okay, so our first question from an online attendee is, won't unions objectify ferociously to a transitional jobs program, perhaps with good reason? The net effect would be downward pressure on wages, no?
It's a great question, and it was actually the question that troubled Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 as he was trying to figure out what to do about the unemployed. There's a Wisconsin connection to this. A fellow named Harry Hopkins was running what they called the relief program back then. And he was getting exactly the same concern, that unions would be opposed and would kill any federally financed jobs program for fear that local and state government would just lay off workers, take advantage of these subsidized workers, which is, I think, the gist of the question. So Hopkins was traveling in the Midwest, and so he went to a football game. He went to a football game that was being played between that Big Ten powerhouse, the University of Chicago. Okay, good laughter. And I don't know if it was Notre Dame. Chicago actually was undefeated against Notre Dame. That's because they canceled their football program around then. So he's sitting in the stands with the president of the university and expresses this concern. The stands that they're sitting on, by the way, were called Steig Field. And those of you that have some knowledge of history will know that this is exactly where the first controlled nuclear reaction was conducted, underneath the bleachers at Steig Field. So luckily it worked. It didn't blow them up or blow anybody else up or blow Chicago up. But so the president of the University of Chicago said, "Good question, Harry Hopkins. You need to talk to John Commons, who was an economist at the University of Wisconsin." Hopkins couldn't do that. He had to go down to Independence, Missouri, to talk to this sort of, not quite famous yet guy named Harry Truman, who was running the jobs program down there. So he sent an aide to talk to Commons. And Commons had this huge desk with paper, and it was just junky. Apparently, he found a speech that had been given back in 18 Dickety-Doo by the founder of the National AFL, American Federation of Labor, before it merged with the CIO, which hadn't even been created yet. A guy named Samuel Gompers. I think he was a cigar makers union. And Gompers had given a speech that Commons remembered, in which he said that the federal government should be the employer of last resort. So Hopkins goes back to Washington, and they took the money from the welfare program, as well as other money, and they created something called the Civil Works Administration, which was a prototype for what became the WPA. Within a few weeks, Hopkins put millions of people to work, millions of unemployed people, some on relief, some not on relief, and they did all kinds of great projects. Later, the WPA came along, and I think that once the unions saw how this was actually being administered, they were okay with it. But precisely to deal, and I'm sorry for that entertaining anecdote, especially about the powerhouse University of Chicago football team. All the legislation, like the one that I showed before, let's go back to 2016 and 2017, that includes very detailed provisions that were worked out with the unions, drafted in language they were comfortable with, that said, you can't displace a worker, you unionized or not unionized. You can't engage in a labor dispute. You can't do anything that interferes with the normal hiring process in the private sector that involves labor unions. So that language seems to be okay. And it's included in, as far as I know, many of the transitional jobs programs that are done on a small scale at the state level, including Wisconsin. I'm sure it's not perfect, but I have never heard from any union leader or representative a concern, provided that the problem is acknowledged as a potential problem and dealt with very clearly and firmly. You got another one?
All right. It's very interesting that the growth of near poor is so much less than the growth of the middle class. Is this some kind of elasticity effect? In the right regime, a little boost has a big impact.
I think, let me just go back to an earlier slide. I assume that the question here is, this is Wisconsin. Okay, we're back to, okay. Yeah, what happens in my view, and I don't pretend to fully understand this, but there's a lot of movement on this slide from left to right. That is, where do the poor go? Well, some of them go into the near poor category, but a greater number leave from that category. And some of the near poor go into above 150, but below 200, but more of them leave. so that people are constantly moving. But the big pull is into the final column on the left here, the middle class, above 200%. Depending on the area, that third category, 150 to 200, will either be a positive, a growth number, or a decline number. I think some of the other slides showed it declining. So, but the main point here is that when you look at the two green columns in this slide on your right, you see that they're both growing, and that's what we want. We want most of the growth to be above 200% of poverty. If not that, then the next best thing is between 150 and 200. And what we don't want is the poor growing. We want that shrinking a lot and the near poor shrinking a lot. So this is the right direction. Part of why, by the way, there is such a large increase in the middle class is that some of the minimum wage effects actually help people earning more than the minimum wage. So it pushes up other wages. Sometimes they call it a knock-on effect. So for example, if the minimum wage is, I'll use round numbers to make it easy. If it's $10 an hour and then it's raised to 20, okay? Then someone who is already making $5 above the old minimum wage may not settle for being at the new minimum wage. They may say, wait a second, you were paying me a lot more before than your lowest wage, minimum wage worker. And now you want me to accept $20 an hour, which is the minimum wage? No, I want 22 or 23. So it's a normal thing because people think about their compensation not just in absolute dollars, but in relative dollars. If I'm doing work that's more productive, requires more whatever than this other person who's being paid less, it's okay for me to pay more. And if there's an increase in compensation, I don't want to be paid the same as that person. I want to be paid a bit more. So some of that knock-on effect, it obviously peters out once you get to the head of the corporation, but in those rows immediately above the new minimum wage, some of those people are going to say, well, I want a bit more myself now, okay? And this is what unions negotiate and so on. That probably contributes to the growth in the population above 200%. The big increases in the EITC do. The fact that the child tax credit is modeled here doesn't begin to phase out until, I think, around close to $90,000 for a single person and double that for a married couple. Again, we're really helping people out in the middle class. And then the child care policy, like K-12 education, it's not everybody gets it. The poorest kid in wherever Bill Gates lives or Warren Buffett lives could go to the same school as Bill Gates' kid or Warren Buffett's kid. So not that happens, but the point I'm making, and this is sort of part of a little bit of the myth, but to some extent the truth, especially in certain communities, that the banker's kid would go to school with the person, working in the garage. There's still some of that going on, less than a lot of us would like, but I think there's some validity to that still. So the point is that some of the child care provision would help a lot of middle-class people. My sense is that those of you who have talked to parents concerned about the cost of child care, by and large, you've been talking with middle-class parents. Maybe not. I think certainly I hear that from people who seem to have good income, own their own home, clearly in the middle class, but shelling out $2,000 a month or $1,500 a month for one child for childcare is a lot even for them. So that's part of why the number in the middle class, all these different factors kick in. Yes.
Thank you so much, David. Charlene Moore, woman for the 10th District. I'm so excited that, you're having this talk today. Um, you're a brilliant mind. And no, I'm serious. And so for sharing this information with us, because there's always this thought that really can we get out of this mess? Because it costs being poor, right? And so poverty pushes when we talk about, the children that are going to inadequate educational institutions, or our criminal, we could talk about all day at our criminal legal system, right? It's going to put people out of jobs. And these jobs that focus solely on poor people, right? And so I really want you to talk a little bit about like the convincing of sort of the powers that be, because some people like the status quo that no, this works. Our jail cells are continually funneled with, with individuals that are poor. Our sort of mediocre school systems are, when those folks that come out that don't know how to read, they take the lower paying jobs and we can exploit them, right? So how do we talk to people that, because I see the benefit,
Yeah.
and probably the people in this room see this benefit, but how do we talk to, again, I use the term those powers that be to say, well, how do we convince them that this will benefit us as a country?
Mm-hmm. That's a powerful question. The examples that I've seen that do the most to convince people who are sort of on the edge about it, don't quite know what to do, are very often less when they hear from people like me with the data and the numbers, and more when they hear from working people, people who they don't expect to talk about work. They expect someone to come in and say, I'm poor, I need this. And when they say, I don't want a handout, what I want is a job so I can support myself and my family, I think that probably does more to persuade skeptics than any of the numbers that I can present. I've seen that happen in action. Part of, I'll give you a concrete example. I worked with Spencer Cox, who was Riverside High School locker mate of mine, to draft the first transitional jobs program for the state of Wisconsin. When Scott Walker became governor, he wanted to get rid of it. And I worked with Connor Williams from Community Advocates. We had an event down, I'm trying to think if it was at the Archdiocese facility in St. Francis, or just in Milwaukee. But we had a black man come up and just say, I had some issues with the law, but I have a job now and I want to keep it. And then we had the employer say, this program has been great. I was thinking to add to my payroll. I took a chance on this guy and it worked out, and I've now hired him permanently. So, you had the testimony of both the individual saying, I want a different life for myself so I can support myself and kids, very often is the case. And then you had an employer saying, I didn't know this guy would work out, but this good, reliable worker, and I've hired him, took him off that program and hired him with my own money. So examples like that, I think, are very powerful for people who are who have ideological screens to sort of filter out this kind of presentation, but that raw emotional message is very powerful. So I remember going to another event where a young man, again, because this is Milwaukee in the central city, not a surprise, a young black man talked about how he got a transitional job, and he went to the grocery store and bought bought some groceries, just with his own money, not food stamps. And he paid too much. So the clerk, the teller, the cashier, handed him some extra money back. "Here's your change, sir." And he said, "That's right, you can keep it. I have a job now." So it was, that this kind of emotional, powerful message. Now, in this case, the cashier didn't need to be persuaded, but it's the kind of message. So I think that that's true. And I'm sorry, Julie has left. So much of what we did with the results of New Hope was to bring these individual stories to legislators. Another thing, I don't know if I told you this story before, Alderwoman Moore, I apologize for not introducing you earlier. Some people will support these for reasons that make no sense to you whatsoever. This my favorite story of all in this whole world. Ellie my wife is kind of saying, "No, don't tell that story. I got to tell this story." So I was involved in drafting the state's first ever supplemental earned income tax credit. And we did manage, in this case, to get kind of a broad cross-section of legislators. There were liberal Democrats like Becky Young and Barb Notstein, and conservative Republicans like Margaret Lewis, and I'm trying to think of another woman who later left to become an evangelical minister. So they were up there talking about this. One of them wanted to have a bigger welfare program. Some of them did. They were okay with that, but they knew that wasn't going to fly because Tommy Thompson was governor, and he was against that. And then others said they wanted to get rid of welfare, but they knew that wasn't going to happen either. So they supported the earned income tax credit because it met both of their needs, more money for people, but not based on welfare, but work. So in the middle of this, a state representative from Janesville, maybe I shouldn't mention his name because we're being recorded, showed up, and he said he was for this too, and people were stunned. Why is he there? He was a Democrat, but a conservative Democrat, pro-gun, pro-life, and he got up there, and he didn't quite use these words, but he basically said, it used to be the man could go and get a job in the factory or an office and bring home enough, and he didn't quite say the little woman, but the wife could stay home where she belongs. That was the message he was delivering. So all the women surrounding him, both left and right, were totally stunned and flabbergasted. And you could see them like looking at each other like, should we kick this guy out of the room? And then, because they were smart politicians, like you, many of your colleagues, they looked at each other and you could tell their minds what they were thinking. They said, wait a second, we got this guy's vote. He's going to vote for this. And he has a couple of people like him in the legislature, and they'll follow his lead. So you could see them kind of going with this look of horror to a look of gritting their teeth and looking forward at the press and the cameras. Sure enough, it passed almost overwhelmingly. Governor Thompson was not keen on it, partly because it wasn't his idea. This often happens in the political sphere, as you know. But he solved that problem by talking about it so much that he kind of presented it as if it were his idea. And of course, the legislators who were happy to have it become law were quite happy to not make a fuss about that, because they knew that if popular governor thinks something's his idea, it's likely to stay in the budget for a long time. So again, all of these things that have nothing to do with spreadsheets or graphs or whatever, that have to do with just people's feelings about this stuff, because this stuff is really basic. We're talking about work. We're talking about enough money to feed yourself and your family and keep the heat on in the winter and have a little cool in the summer and take the kids on a vacation. I mean, we're talking about really deeply powerful, emotional. So my answer to you is never give up on the spreadsheets or the charts or the wonderfully illustrated PowerPoints. So thank you, Alyssa, again. But trying to make this as much rooted in people's values as possible. And the New Deal people that as I read the history of the New Deal, they understood that. Someone once complained to Harry Hopkins about, you're spending money on artists. You're hiring people to paint these murals in post offices. And his answer was something to the effect of, well, damn it, they have to eat too. Well, that made sense even to people who were skeptical. So again, these powerful, simple, emotional messages. And one thing I'll say, I think I mentioned this to you when we spoke. I often use the Bible when I talk about this stuff. My favorite biblical commentary is to say, well, there are actually 11 commandments. And most people, I've done this in churches, synagogues, all kinds of places. People look at me like, what are you talking about? 11 commandments. There's 10 commandments. We know that. And then I say, well, what makes a commandment a commandment? What's the magic verb? Shall. And what's that third or fourth commandment say, depending on which version of the 10 commandments you read? It says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. The seventh day is a Sabbath, and take a rest. Well, and then I would say, so when God ordered people to work, he wasn't saying, well, work if you can. He wasn't saying, well, it's discretionary. He wasn't saying, well, you may work, but you may not work. It was a commandment, just like all the other ones. So the message, to me, the message is not, this isn't about religious preaching so much as saying, this is so deep in us that the obligation to work, along with the obligation to rest, are so deeply rooted in our culture that they're in the Bible. Every version of the Bible says shall. People must work, and they feel it. People feel bad when they can't meet their responsibilities. So tapping into all of these deeply felt feelings, I think, is part of what works. Thank you.
We do have one more online, so I'm going to
Okay.
have the folks in the room try to catch David.
And
after.
I'm happy to stay afterwards if there's questions that we don't get to as a group, but go ahead.
Sure. One of the most obvious and objected to manifestations of poverty is homelessness. Do you have data on how these policies would impact that? This would be useful in persuading people.
Funny you should ask. I was having this conversation with Andy and Maduela before we began. I'm not a housing expert, and I often find that what I know quickly becomes not true pretty quickly, and then I'm even less of an expert. My instinct is that when people have more money in the form of just money, not a stamp or not a coupon or something, but just cash, that it increases the likelihood that they will have better housing on the whole, on average. There's several powerful reasons for that. One of which is they can afford the rent if they have more money. Any rent, you're better off affording it if you've got more rather than less. Okay. Secondly, if you've got more income and it's at your discretion, if a landlord really mistreats you, doesn't clean up the cockroaches or the lead or fix the broken window or the HVAC, you can leave. You can say, I can go to another place because I've got greater purchasing power. And then, of course, for some people, it lets them cross the line to potential home ownership. On the other hand, landlords are very smart, developers are very smart, and if they see potential tenants or actual tenants with more money, a natural instinct would be to charge a higher rent. That's a concern. And the question that I don't know, I've heard different perspectives on this, is that if within low-income communities there is an aggregate more affordability, that is affordability in the sense of people having more money, will real estate developers start building more rental housing that's good housing? Or will they say, no, we're just going to keep, from New York or Chicago or some other place, just buy up a lot of what's there and jack up the rents as much as we can and take advantage of people having more money? I don't know, but I'm not sure we'll ever know until that happens. I guess I would say that from what I know about the housing crisis, that this is not going to make a huge difference in it. but it might have positive effects, might have negative. I would hope that people will continue to do the creative things they're doing just to get housing to be more affordable, dealing with zoning and planning and manufactured housing and all the other things that are being tried all over Milwaukee as well as Wisconsin. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for that one.
Yeah, we can go to Deshaun.
Thank you for your presentation. Quick question. Since 2018, we know that there's been a rapid expansion of AI and robotic innovation. What are any countermeasures or thoughts around countermeasures when you're talking about increasing the minimum wage and now employers are looking like I can do so much more with the AI system, robotics that might lay people off as a counter to losing in my billions by hiring people at a minimum wage that's higher, $15 higher than what I used to, whatever it might be. What are countermeasures that may not have been thought of in 2018 that we have to think about or can implement to offset that?
The main answer that I give to that is to say the starting point, to go back to the beginning of this discussion, my starting point is adults and their role as workers. And the relationship between the number of those adults and the number of jobs and good jobs is constantly in a state of flux. AI is another flux-producing factor. Competition from China and other places is a huge factor. Just the improvement in manufacturing techniques and automation before AI, before anybody knew what that meant, are a factor. Demographics are a factor. Population, the baby boom and the bust and this different groups. So my answer to this is simply to say, whatever the result is at a particular time, and of course a big factor, I left out maybe the biggest one, we have crashes, we have recessions that have nothing to do with any of the other things I just mentioned. They're just, sometimes they're cyclical, sometimes they're caused by a specific crisis like COVID. So we have to plan for the likelihood that over 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to see a big gap between the number of adults who need to work to support themselves and their families and what the labor market is offering as it goes through these fluctuations. We need to be prepared to ramp up the number of subsidized jobs, transitional jobs, if there's a big decline in the private sector. We also need to be able to rapidly decrease the number of those jobs when the private sector can absorb people. The New Deal is a great example because it did both. In 1933, 25% unemployment. They created literally millions of new jobs through the CWA, later the WPA. Then as the economy began to recover in 38, 39, and then we began to see the overlay of increased war production, the draft, more people went into the military, more people were hired to build planes and tanks and guns. Then later we get into the war. Basically, they ended the jobs program. To me, they made a mistake. They should have kept a residual program, the structure to bring it back to life. They were smart people, but they weren't smart enough to predict that we'll never, ever again have a recession. So they should have kept it just even at a real low level to deal with pockets of unemployment, maybe, and then bring back those jobs as the economy normalizes. But that's my vision of what a jobs program should be like. It should not be static. It should have what you might call a permanent management structure, but the actual number of jobs should expand and contract countercyclically, regardless of what causes the downward part of the cycle in terms of the private sector shrinking.
All right, so we're at time. So if we want to thank David for his presentation, if you have other questions, please stick around, and I'm sure David will be happy to talk to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I'll get this up so anyone who wants to copy it can. I apologize for not writing.
Yeah, that was good.